Hello, my name's Steve Jordans. Really happy to be here as part of this TEDx event, um, and really happy with my normal daytime job, which is teaching psychology at the University of Toronto. Now, like anybody who teaches psychology, sooner or later in the course you have to talk about this gentleman, Sigmund Freud. And when I introduce Sigmund Freud to my students, I often say that I often imagine Sigmund Freud in a singles bar because I think of all the psychologists that existed, he probably had the very best come on line. It would go something like this. So, I've been watching you from the other side of the bar, and I could not help but notice some tendencies in your behavior that tell me a lot about the side of you that I don't think you even know exists. Would you like me to tell you about this hidden you? Who could say no, right? Pull up a stool. Tell me all about this me that doesn't exist. Well, it's really a fascinating concept, that notion that there are sort of two forces that drive our behavior. The force that we kind of are most aware of are, the thoughts that are in our head and the conscious decisions we make, but also the notion of some underlying force that's less rational, less conscious. And of course, Freud did not come up with this idea. It goes back, decades, but perhaps the most formal presentation of it was by René Descartes in what he called Cartesian dualism. Now, René was trying to think about life, really, and how souls fit into the big picture of the existence of life. And he ultimately came to this perspective that he thought when you think about animals he ultimately believed were just very sophisticated biological machines. He thought their behavior reflected very basic natural processes that somehow enabled them to learn how to behave in ways that optimized survival, but did so in a way that they could do this without any rational thought. Humans, on the other hand, he thought were also biological machines. So he thought all of that machinery from animals was also there for humans, but that in addition, humans gained this ability for rational thought. He thought through rational thought, I think therefore I am, they could in fact control the biological machinery. They could be, as it were, puppet masters. And that this enabled them the ability to do things that an animal could never do. So again, we have that dualistic nature, the basic natural machinery with the rationality or the conscious thought on top of it. Okay, well, let's think about this for a while. And let's be clear about what this natural side of us is and how it might work. So let's take Fido here as our example. How might Fido manage to behave in the world in a way that makes sense? Well, from psychology and psychology results that have happened since Freud, there's a couple of principles we can draw on that can really help us understand things. The first is the notion of observational learning. It comes from Albert Bandura. In Bandura's famous study, he had children watch cartoons. Those cartoons were either violent in nature or not violent in nature. After the children watched the cartoons, and there were different children in each group, they would then be introduced to a play area. And the play area contained a whole bunch of toys, building blocks, various things, but it also contained things like guns, toy guns, and things like Bobo dolls that you could beat up. And what he found was that the children who watched the violent cartoons were much more likely to be violent in the playroom. In fact, in one sort of famous picture, a child is straddling the Bobo doll and beating it with the gun. He literally is showing, what we would consider extreme levels of violence. So what Bandura said about all this was that we all have this very low-level learning mechanism that right from birth pushes us to observe the entities around us and to model our behavior after them. We do, as a first course of action, what they do. Okay? And we now know about things like mirror neurons that support all this. So this seems to be the most basic learning mechanism we have: imitation, modeling, observational learning. Now, That's not all there is to it. Skinner, a very famous psychologist, talked about how the consequences of our behavior also shape our behavior. When we go and emit some behavior in a situation, consequences follow. If we behave a certain way and good things happen, we're more likely to stay on that track, behave that way in the future. But if we behave in some way and bad things happen, then we're more likely to tweak our behavior, change it a little bit, try something a little different. Okay, but again, Skinner emphasized that this kind of learning does not require any rational thought. In fact, Skinner quite famously believed that conscious experience was irrelevant in human beings. And so the idea is with these two principles, our little Fido here can get through life pretty well. He can learn to behave in ways that others around him behave, ways that have been already shown to be successful because they're still alive, and with some subtle tweaks that allow him to shape his behavior for specific situations, he can behave quite effectively. All right. So then why rational thought? Why don't we all just rely on these behaviors? If it works well for some beings, why do humans have rational thought? What's the purpose? What I am going to claim today is that the reason we have rational thought is to allow us to deal with situations where the behavior of all of those around us is inappropriate. Let's think about this for a while. Imagine you're surrounded by a bunch of people acting inappropriate. If all you have is observational learning and just lost it, operant conditioning, you're going to behave like they do, and you will have mass inappropriate behavior. You need a way out of that. Let me give you an example. Let's imagine you're a child growing up in the 1800s in the southern part of America when slavery was everywhere. Your parents owned slaves, your neighbors owned slaves, everybody owns slaves, everybody treats them like possessions. If all you have to rely on are observational learning and operant conditioning, aren't you likely to accept that behavior and just adopt it yourself? Well, in fact, of course, many people did just that. And this is an important point about critical thinking. I will often argue that critical thinking is not natural. It needs to be developed. It needs to be practiced. It needs to be worked on. And many of us don't get that practice. So I put to you the somewhat controversial claim that many humans do not think critically too much about a lot of things, that we fall prey to the same tendencies that are outlined in that previous slide, and we behave like those around us do. And so it becomes really important that we have some members within our group who do think about it and maybe come to in a different position. I like to call these people opinion oddballs. And so now, but what's an opinion oddball to do? They find themselves in a situation where everybody en masse believes, for example, that slavery is okay. Well, if you want to cause change, if you want to somehow convince these large groups of people that their behaviors are inappropriate, you need an argument. You need some basis upon which to get them to think as you did. Now, it so happened around this time in America itself was having a bit of a battle with England. In fact, they sometimes said England is treating us like they're slaves. And they responded to it with something famous called the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Ammunition for our opinion oddball. Our opinion oddball can say, if this is who we are, if this is what America means, then America cannot have slavery. But realize you need that critical thinking. You need that argument. Okay. Now, sometimes an argument is not enough. In the case of slavery, it took a civil war, right, to really cause behavioral change. So the arguments often have to pile up. Why? Well, again, these natural ways of doing things are very powerful. And humans are not prone to change. In fact, there is a real resistance to large, whole-scale change of this sort. And I want you to feel it because it is something you can actually feel. So I'm going to enter into a different part of the talk where I'm hoping to make you feel a little uncomfortable. But I'm doing it for a purpose. So I really want you to listen, but mostly I want you to feel inside. Okay? What I'm going to talk about now is what you eat, where it comes from. Because this is one of those things where, if, like you, I assume, I was, for many years, eating like my parents ate. Meat and potatoes every meal. We've been told by everybody, the food groups, these are the things you should be eating. This is healthy food, yada yada. Mass indoctrination, if you will. But I also heard rumblings. Kentucky Fried Chicken raises their chicken in dangerous ways. There's stuff going on. You should hear about it. But I largely resisted any tendency to look into those. But then, for various reasons, at one point in time, that was broken, and I decided to look into things a little bit. One of the first things I found out, by the way, is that, shockingly, 99% of the meat in America is factory farmed. Okay, I've heard of factory farms. You've probably heard of factory farms. These dark corners of our world where meat is produced. We don't hear much about them. That's not by mistake, by the way. But I didn't know a lot about them. And so I looked into it a little bit more. And I found, to my surprise, that this seemed to be one of these situations like slavery. It seemed to be, at some level, even more powerful than slavery. There seemed to be 3 lines of argument suggesting that humans en masse were engaging in highly inappropriate behavior. I'll go through them really quickly. The first is, let's say you see yourself as an environmentalist, as this gentleman does. Well, it turns out that if you look into some facts of factory farming, that factory farms, because they condense so many animals in a small space, produce 37% of the methane emissions produced by the planet. And methane has 20 times the effect on global warming than CO2 does. In fact, a UN study in 2006 claims that if you combine all the harmful emissions from all forms of transportation on the planet, and you compare that to the harmful emissions from factory farming is worse. Wow. It takes 2,400 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of meat, compared to 25 gallons for 1 pound of wheat. 11 times more fossil fuels, forget the methane for a second, just the fossil fuels, 11 times more are needed to produce 1 unit of meat versus 1 unit of plant protein. And it takes 3 to 7 grams or whatever units of protein from plants to produce 1 unit of protein from animals. It turns out that animals are very inefficient protein machines. And we're causing our environment huge damage by relying on meat consumption as our primary way of providing nutrition to ourselves. I found that really surprising. So if you're an environmentalist, it sounds like you should be against factory farms, and maybe against eating meat in general. What if you care about health? Yeah, there's various stats out there. All these studies you can look at in a number of ways, but generally vegetarians are found to live 7 years longer, 15 for vegans, even longer than meat eaters. Red meat, of course, health-wise, is the main culprit. Increases risk of heart disease by 16% and 10%. That's unprocessed red meat. If you have processed red meat, those go up about 5% each. That's from the Harvard School of Public Health. If you look at steak, a unit of steak can contain 64 grams of protein, but 34 of those are fat. So, over half fat, and a lot of that's bad fat, versus lentils where it's 18 to 1. So much lower fat concentration. So all of these things suggest, red meat especially is very unhealthy. Now you can make a case, in fact, that eating fish-only diet, as this gentleman here does, is healthy. So you might not leave the health thing saying all meat eating is bad, but you'd certainly say, whoa, a lot of it should go. A A lot of it should go. What if you're just an animal lover? Well, if you're an animal lover, keep in mind that the goal of factory farms is to maximize volume while minimizing price. You want to create unnaturally large, which they do with growth hormones, and which means unhealthy, by the way, because the body wasn't meant to be that large. That's what the antibiotics were for. Creatures, and you house them in the smallest possible quarters. That's what a factory farm is. That's what it is. It also turns out that there's routine mistreatment. I simply ask you, what do you think happens to the male chickens? They're useless. How do you think they kill them? I won't tell you. But I suggest, if you knew, you wouldn't like it. And if you don't believe me, look at the video Meet Your Meat on YouTube. There are also very little oversight. I was shocked by this, by the way, that the things that would get you charged as cruelty to animals if you did it to your pet would not be a problem at all in a factory farm. In fact, the rules there, those laws don't apply to factory farms. The rules that apply to factory farms are something that they call industry standards. So as long as some behavior is done industry-wide, even if it's a horrible behavior, then it's okay. You're just meeting industry standards. That's the level of inquiry and oversight, and it's very startling. And so really what it boils down to is humans intentionally causing unnecessary suffering on a billions of creatures per year scale. Why? Because they like the taste of meat. Okay, you're like, whoa, this critical thinking talk just turned into an anti-meat eating talk, and it did. But now, how do you feel? What you've just been exposed to is an opinion oddball who's been challenging, perhaps, your widely held beliefs, widely indoctrinated beliefs. How did that feel? How does that feel? You know, a thunderstorm, you have a cold air and a hot air mass come together, and it produces this feeling, this tension that comes forth in sound and light. Well, when critical thinking hits indoctrinated beliefs, that same tension happens. Very often, that tension is resolved by allowing the indoctrinated beliefs to come back, to take over. It is the path of least resistance. It is the comfortable way to go, because in our indoctrinated beliefs are our foundation. To go in a different direction means to throw away that foundation. And to now, let's say in the meat eating one, to find yourself in a grocery store and say, what am I going to cook tonight? I have to learn a whole bunch of new behaviors. I have to find new recipes and new foods. I have to really change my life. And we're resistant to that. And we feel that resistance when those two come together. And at that point, it's all about what you do about it. And if the critical thinkers are good enough, and if the arguments are strong enough, then there is the potential, as there was in 1865 with slavery, to change social behavior on a grand scale. Two roads diverged in the wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference.